Imagine you are an American engineer desperate for work during the Great Depression. A job offer comes from the last place you've expected, the Soviet Union. You pack your bags, board a ship, and cross the world to build Stalin's factories. But soon, your dream turns into a nightmare. You are accused of sabotage, arrested, and thrown into a Siberian labor camp. This is not fiction. It's a forgotten piece of history, a story of idealism, betrayal, and ruthless power. My name is Elvira Barry. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and today we are uncovering how Stalin hired thousands of Americans and Europeans to build his industrial empire, only to imprison many of them. How could this happen? Why were these foreign specialists first welcomed, then cast aside? And what hidden truths does this reveal about Soviet society and the dangers we still face today? The early dream of the Soviet Union was a world socialist revolution. At first, the Bolsheviks believed workers and peasants across Europe would rise up, following Russia's example. They didn't. Then, in 1920, the Red Army attempted to export the revolution to Poland, but it was in such a weakened state that it couldn't break through Polish defenses. Next, the Bolsheviks tried financing communist parties abroad, hoping this would ignite revolutions elsewhere. It didn't. No one wanted the kind of civil war I describe in detail in my historical novel Russian Treasures, link in the description. By the 1920s, Russia's economy was in ruins, and the Soviet Union was so weak that almost no one cared about it, except the members of communist parties and a handful of ideologically charged enthusiasts, usually rebellious sons and daughters of wealthy families who read too much cheerful Soviet propaganda. When Stalin came to power in 1927, he realized the Soviet dream was impossible unless Russia became both a military power and an industrial powerhouse. So he launched a grand construction campaign, squeezing every resource from an already destitute population. There was just one problem. The Soviet Union didn't have enough specialists to build this industrial future. So, why did thousands of Western engineers, builders, and technicians pack their bags for a distant totalitarian state where even owning a toaster was a luxury? One word: unemployment. In 1929, the Great Depression shattered global markets, throwing millions out of work. Twice during the 1930s, the Dust Bowl buried America's farmland under greed, wiping out harvests and bankrupting families. The shockwaves were brutal. People stopped buying cars and tractors, companies stopped building factories, and architects, engineers, and designers were left jobless for years. The Soviet government saw an opportunity. Stalin was determined to catch up with industrial Europe within a decade. The 5 year plans were launched with huge publicity. But the Soviet treasury was empty, so cash had to come from somewhere. First, from the peasants. Grain was requisitioned for kopecks and sold abroad for hard currency. Second, from exports of timber, coal, copper, and gold, much of it mined by Gulag prisoners. Third, from art sales. Between 1930 and 1933, the Hermitage quietly shipped more than 250 masterpieces to millionaires like Andrew Mellon and Armand Hammer, earning tens of millions. Quick side note: many top American museum collections began with these sales. I've already started writing a historical novel about this for my Russian Treasures series. Western governments hated the Bolsheviks, but they were desperate. Trade barriers fell as nations needed cheap grain and raw materials. Germany led the way. Devastated by the Depression, and German bankers eagerly loaned Moscow millions, believing a dictatorship was a more reliable client than private firms. London followed with a major trade deal in 1930. By 1933, the United States officially recognized the USSR. Suddenly, Stalin had both markets and a gold mine of foreign expertise. By 1932, over 40,000 foreigners were working on Soviet construction sites, about a quarter of them Americans, the rest mainly Germans and Austrians driven abroad by mass unemployment. They brought the best Western know how with them, from Ford's moving assembly lines to Siemens equipment for power plants. That's how modern assembly lines appeared in Gorky, croup rolling mills rose in Chelyabinsk, and blast furnaces, drawn by German draftsmen, towered over the steppes of Kuznetsk. But wait, what happened to Russia's own engineers? Before the Bolsheviks seized power, Russia boasted the largest engineering corps in Europe. Talented graduates flowed from St. Petersburg Politech and the technical universities of Riga, Kiev, and Tomsk. Yet within 5 years, that priceless human capital had all but vanished, lost to three tragic forces. First, immigration. As the White Army retreated, many civilians fled with it. Between 1917 and 1922, an estimated 1 to 3 million citizens left Russia, including a sizable share of scientists and engineers. They scattered across France, Germany, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and China, taking their knowledge with them. Second, the Civil War and the Red Terror. Historians estimate up to 200,000 people were executed for counter-revolution, while millions more died in prisons, hospitals, or on the battlefield. Among the victims were leading specialists of the old regime, like Mikhail Tikhvinsky, a pioneering chemical engineer and oil expert, shot in 1921 for allegedly plotting against Soviet power. Third, the purges of the 1920s and 1930s. In the early Soviet years, the Bolsheviks tolerated all experts out of necessity. But the mantra, the working class is the vanguard, the bourgeoisie is suspect, soon turned into a weapon. The state's call for class vigilance gave ambitious party climbers and petty bureaucrats a fast path to promotion. Denounce your engineer boss, clear his desk, and replace him with a red specialist. The tipping point came with the Shakhty trial in 1928, described in my novel The Prince of the Soviets. 53 coal mine engineers were accused of raking. 6 were executed, dozens jailed. For the first time, the word engineer officially became synonymous with enemy. Pravda blamed the failures of the 5-year plans on former bourgeoisie specialists, and party committees across the country demanded purges. 2 years later came the Prom-Party case, in which academician Leonid Ramzin and a group of economists and designers were accused of conspiring with the French government and Russian emigres in Paris. Then came the whirlwind of the Great Terror, 1936-1938. The secret police arrested former people by quota, with three-man tribunals delivering death sentences in minutes. At least 750,000 were executed, and more than 1 million sent to the camps, whole design bureaus and university faculties among them. By 1940, only a handful of pre-revolutionary engineers remained at their desks. The vacuum was filled with foreigners and hastily trained red engineers, loyal, but often inexperienced. It's important to note, Stalin never issued a master plan titled Destroy the Engineers. His goal was total mobilization of resources, and the doctrine of bourgeois unreliability was a convenient tool to maintain control. Any manager could score points by accusing a specialist of sabotage, feeding a system where every arrest created a vacancy for a party loyalist. By the late 1930s, Soviet industry had gained thousands of new technicians, but at the cost of losing an irreplaceable generation of engineers and the culture of meticulous, independent engineering thought they represented. It created a workplace where one miscalculation could cost you not just a bonus, but your life. In 1927, a Soviet trade office tucked away on Broadway in New York quietly transformed into a head-hunting hub. Amtorg's director, economist Saul Braun, received a clear directive from the government: recruit top-tier talent for the first 5-year plan. Braun swiftly signed deals with Ford, General Electric, the Austin Company, and Albert Kahn's renowned Detroit Architectural Bureau. Every visa, advance payment, and one-way ticket to the USSR passed through Amtorg's hands. By 1931, the United States had 13 million unemployed, and Soviet posters promising up to $200 a month plus housing sounded like salvation. In just 8 months that year, Amtorg received over 100,000 applications from Americans, engineers, mechanics, teachers, even doctors, desperate for work. German newspapers claimed hundreds of thousands were preparing to leave for Russia, but Moscow imposed a cap: no more than 40,000 foreigners per year. Selection was strict. Priority went to those with rare skills or those who could bring their own tools. By early 1931, Soviet factories had hired around 10,000 foreign specialists. The peak came in the summer of 1932. 42,230 foreign specialists were working in the USSR, half of them German or Austrian, a quarter American, and the rest Finns, Czechs, French, and Japanese. Contracts typically ran 1 to 3 years and guaranteed free passage, housing, and payment in hard currency until 1933, or in currency rubles at a favorable exchange rate. The Secret Service handled political vetting, checking past affiliations, union activity, and personal loyalties. But the wave of migration was not limited to left-wing idealists. The Depression pushed eastward workers of every political stripe, including African Americans escaping the brutality of Jim Crow laws. In just 3 years, Stalin secured a large-scale grain import, offering in return a kind of job security rare anywhere else in the world at the time. Though, as we will see, that security would prove temporary. So, what exactly did these foreigners build? Gorky Automobile Plant, GAZ. Under the Ford USSR contract signed on May 31st, 1929, the Soviet purchased 72,000 knockdown kits and secured Detroit architects on site. American engineers set up the moving assembly line, trained Soviet workers, and launched the production of Model A and AA cars, rebadged as GAZ. Stalingrad Tractor Plant. A deal with Albert Kahn Associates made the Detroit Bureau the chief consultant for Soviet industrial construction. Kahn's team designed the tractor works and dozens of tank production bays, while steel and machinery arrived from the US in prefabricated sections. Magnitogorsk Steel Combine, rising from the Chelyabinsk steppe, the first plant and company town layouts were drafted by Arthur J. McKee and Company, while blast furnace specifications came from Freyne Engineering. Dniepergas Dam. This massive hydroelectric project was designed by American engineer Hugh Cooper, with turbines supplied by General Electric. Its 1932 launch became a showcase of Soviet-American collaboration. Through its Moscow office, Госпроектстрой, Kahn's team produced over 500 blueprints for heavy industry projects, tractor plants in Chelyabinsk and Kharkov, aircraft factory number 22 in Philly, and dozens of thermal and hydroelectric stations. These foreigners brought more than just blueprints. They imported the flow line mindset, safety standards, and the very concept of the industrial city. Without their expertise, there would have been no 1940s Soviet motor pool, no T-34 tanks, and no aluminum for aircraft production. Life for Western engineers in Stalin's Russia was a study in contrasts, privilege amid ruin. On the 1930s Russian grid, foreigners carried a special INSNAP card that guaranteed roughly 15 pounds of meat, 3 pounds of butter, and 6.5 pounds of sugar per person each month. A Soviet second category worker got about 2 pounds of meat and never saw butter at all. Pay arrived in hard currency, running 8 to 10 times higher than local wages. GAZ boasted an English language school and a baseball team. In Moscow, expatriates read the Moscow Daily Times and shopped in hard currency stores called Torksin. Housing followed the pecking order. Senior staff lived in fenced-off cottages. Magnitogorsk compound was literally nicknamed American Village, with wood stoves and tiny gardens. Rank-and-file feeders bunked in barracks or canvas tents. Welder John Scott recalled the split: comfortable suburbs for specialists, officials, and foreigners, while Bashkir shepherds, only a month away from medieval times, froze to death in tents. Relations with locals were complicated. On one hand, expertise earned respect. Many foreigners became udarniki, shock workers, and even collected medals. On the other hand, a pay differential of 10-1 bred envy. In Behind the Urals, John Scott describes how chronic shortages of something as simple as bolts were a daily reality, and wet concrete collapses were considered normal. The language barrier often led to frustration and sometimes outright conflict. Foreign specialists sometimes clashed with each other too. At the Stalingrad Tractor Works, a notorious canteen brawl broke out when two white American workers attacked their black colleague, Robert Robinson. Soviet newspapers quickly turned the incident into an anti-racist morality tale. Robinson, who would go on to spend 44 years working in the USSR, later recounted his experiences in his book Black on Red. Black specialists were rare, but in Russia they found doors closed at home. Oliver Golden, an agronomist from Mississippi, helped cultivate a fast-maturing version of American cotton and worked as a teacher at the Tashkent Institute of Irrigation and Melioration. Lovett Ford Whiteman, a communist activist, met a harsher fate. Arrested in 1936, he was shipped to Kolyma and died of starvation in 1939. Proof that even ideological zeal was not insurance. By the mid-1930s, few sensed any danger. Many foreigners began to see themselves as a kind of new nobility. They were well aware of the purchase, but it was easy to look the other way. After all, when the regime pays you well and directs its rage elsewhere, it's tempting to think, I'm different. I'm too valuable for them. They wouldn't dare touch me. Then came the Secret Service's National Operations, Order number 00439 of 25th of July, 1937, commanded that every German citizen working in defense plants and railroads be arrested. Within a month, 472 people were seized. By year's end, the whole topped 800, nearly one-fifth of all registered German specialists. Similar quota were issued for other suspect nationalities. Even scientific luminaries were crushed. Fritz Hatermans, a German physicist who advanced the theory of stellar fusion, was working in the Kharkiv Fistek. In December 1937, he was taken as a spy. After a year of torture, he was handed to the Gestapo, narrowly escaping a Soviet firing squad. The treatment of Americans was selective. Some, like Welder offer John Scott, left when they realized people were vanishing at night. Others were offered Soviet passports in exchange for silence. Historian Pavel Polyan estimates that at least 10,000 foreigners passed through the Gulag in 1937-1938. Roughly a third were engineers and technicians from the giant construction projects. What became of them? Survivors either repatriated. Robert Robinson finally returned to the United States in 1974. or lived out their days in the Soviet Union, released only after Stalin's death. Their contribution to Soviet industry proved priceless, but many paid for it with years or lives behind barbed wire. In the 1930s, the United States, Germany, and others viewed the USSR through a keyhole marked quick profit. Detroit automakers needed orders, German steel mills needed customers, and legions of jobless engineers needed to feed their families. Almost no one asked what comes next. In June 1944, Stalin boasted to US Chamber of Commerce President Eric Johnston. About two-thirds of all major industrial enterprises in the USSR were built with America's help. Within a few years, those very plants were churning out T-34 tanks, Katyusha rockets, and jet aircraft, forcing the West to spend trillions of dollars and nearly half a century of Cold War to contain the monster it had midwifed. A similar script unfolded after the USSR collapsed. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Europe's mantra was, "We need cheap Russian fuel right now." Without it, the economy chokes. By 2021, the EU was importing 155 billion cubic meters of gas, with 45% coming from Gazprom. Direct cash transfers for oil and gas run close to 100 billion euros every year. That foreign exchange flood enabled Vladimir Putin to strengthen his power, expand the security state, and modernize the army. When that same army crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, the not-so-cheap energy bill came due. The ensuing energy crunch cost the EU almost 700 billion euros by mid-2023. The gas bill for 2022 alone ballooned to 400 billion euros, more than triple the 2021 figure. Europe had to scramble, subsidize households and businesses, erect LNG terminals, and buy fuel at eye-watering spot prices. The lesson here is strategic, not moral. Concentrating resources in one fist breeds dictatorship. Dictatorship sooner or later breeds war. Cooperation with Russia, China, or any authoritarian regime is unavoidable in an interdependent world, but it needs safety valves, diversified supply chains, transparent contracts, and ironclad safeguards for rights and freedoms. Planning horizon must stretch 10 to 20 years, not one fiscal quarter. A bargain that looks irresistible today often returns as a bill for our children. The point is not to shun cooperation, but to structure it so that no single leader ever holds all the levers. It's harder, pricier upfront, politically thankless, yet it may spare our grandchildren from racing around the planet with another fire hose. So, what can we learn from this hidden chapter of history? Stalin's industrial miracle wasn't a Soviet triumph alone. It was built on American and European expertise, later erased and betrayed. Understanding this helps us see the dangers of short-term thinking, unchecked power, and partnerships built on desperation rather than trust. If this video opened your eyes, sparked your curiosity, or revealed something new about how the modern world was built, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. For those who want to support deeper explorations into Russia's hidden histories, consider becoming a member of my think tank community or simply buy me a coffee. Your contribution helps keep stories like this alive. And if you are intrigued by the hidden side of Russia, don't miss my other channel, Elvira Bari Forbidden Books, where history comes alive through gripping stories filled with secrets, drama, and historical revelations. All the links you need are right below this video. Thank you for watching, and most importantly, thank you for caring about the truth.